Okay, today we're going to talk about what I call the crisis of democracy, especially in Europe in the 20s and early 30s. This is basically starting with the end of World War I, which overthrows a lot of European monarchies and dictatorships and whatnot, and spreads democracy pretty generally throughout Europe. All these different countries, they get parliaments and they become citizens under constitutions, and they get the right to vote. So they will become democratic countries, and we're going to talk about how that movement toward democracy runs into major problems in the 20s and 30s, especially economic, which always creates political problems, political realignments, and how by the end of this discussion we'll see the rise of a new political movement that is basically anti-democracy in a lot of ways, and that will lead Europe and also eventually the United States directly into World War II, which we'll talk about later. But we're going to start off today talking about the United States' role in Europe, what U.S. foreign policy is for Europe at the end of the war. So here's a map of Europe at the end of the war, which we have already talked about before. The United States came out of the Great War, what we today call World War I, as the economic powerhouse of the world, really for two reasons. Number one, the other major economic powers, the industrialized powers, were mostly located in Europe before the war, and they attacked each other. So they did great economic and physical harm to each other. They bombed each other's factories and whatnot, or tried to attack each other's supply lines as much as they possibly could. So that really drags down a lot of European industrial economic development and slows them down greatly during the war. There's a lot of destruction. And a lot of those countries start running out of money to buy goods, so they start borrowing. And the one big economy that's not really involved in the war for a long time is the United States. So European companies and European countries, governments, borrow from U.S. entities like the U.S. government, and sometimes, or very often, from U.S. banks in order to get the money to continue fighting the war. So the United States emerges from World War I as what we in economic terms call the creditor nation. They're the big source of loans. So the United States is very much tied into the European economic system and wants to see Europe become very stable and economically prosperous so that the European governments and companies could repay those loans in the 1920s in the post-war period. An attempt to create long-term political stability is really the Versailles Treaty, which the results of we see here on this map from the 1920s, redraws the European borders and tries to make a lot of these European countries, builds entirely new countries, especially in Eastern Europe with Czechoslovakia and Poland, Austria, and then Hungary and Yugoslavia. And these countries are democracies. And this is what Wilson calls the New World Order of democracy and citizenship rights and constitutions, voting rights, and hopefully political stability. Wilson talks about this as basically spreading freedom and liberty to a lot of these European societies that for centuries had been ruled by kings. And even the countries that remain, like Germany, the German king is knocked out of office through a revolution, and Germany becomes a democracy also with an elected parliament called the Reichstag, and a German president who is elected by the German people. The problem, though, is that Wilson goes and negotiates this treaty and doesn't get all of what he wants, but gets some of it, and brings the settlement treaty back to the United States, where under the Constitution the U.S. Senate has to ratify any foreign treaty by a two-thirds vote, two-thirds approval. And Wilson cannot get, especially the Republicans in the Senate, to endorse his treaty. Wilson is a Democratic Party guy. And so the U.S. Senate does not ratify the Versailles Treaty, so the United States never formally takes part in the Versailles settlement. And this is all happening in 1919, and that kind of experience, Wilson is generally in bad health during a lot of this. He had high blood pressure and whatnot, so he suffers a stroke that incapacitates him. So Wilson will not run for re-election in 1920, the year after all this is happening. Wilson won the elections of 1912 and 1916. Under the Constitution at the time, he could have run for a third term. It was legal for him to do that. But he's incapacitated, and the American voting public turns against the Democrats and votes a guy named Warren Harding into the presidency. So the Harding administration, Warren Harding wins the election of November 1920 for president, and he'll be inaugurated in March 1921. So a Republican administration comes into office, and they have entirely different views of economic policy and foreign policy. So the Harding administration's idea of like this return to normalcy, which is his big calling card that he ran on, their foreign policy will basically be run by President Harding himself. Another guy, his appointed Secretary of State named Charles Evans Hughes, who was a long-term Republican politician, had been the Republican nominee for president in the previous election in 1916. These two guys, along with the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, will basically run U.S. foreign policy into the 1920s, starting in spring of 1921 when they go into office. So what do they want? What are their major goals for the United States in the world? Number one, they want what they call the economic open door, which is basically the freedom of international trade, that companies should be able to go from one country with their boats and move around the world pretty much freely. That's what the open door means. They have an open door access to other parts of the globe. And they should be able to move around pretty much wherever they want. It's like commercial freedom, the freedom of commerce, to go from one place and buy and sell goods in different countries and move stuff around and whatnot. Technically they call it the open door. And it comes with a lot of kind of slogans, political slogans. So the Harding administration often says things like, commerce is the lifeblood of civilization, that all kind of advanced modern countries, their basis is in buying and selling, commerce, moving goods around, commercial activity. They also say things like the business of America is business, that the United States isn't about foreign conquest or imperialism or domination or anything like that. They just want the right to pursue business opportunities all over the place. So that's their definition of what the United States government should be protecting. And obviously, in order to protect and guard this open access all over the world, the Harding administration is a great advocate of having a very strong Navy, because in this time when airplanes have only been around for 15 years by this point, so airplanes aren't really well developed. They're not very powerful, and you're just starting to get even transatlantic flights going from, say, New York City to London or Paris in Western Europe. In this period where planes are not very powerful yet, the ability of a government to project military power into other parts of the world is still determined by how strong of a navy they have. So the Harding administration wants to build up the U.S. Navy to guarantee this open door, this open access all over the world, and they'll start building it, or continue building it up, which was an ongoing American kind of project from the late 1800s. But the United States, under especially the Harding administration, they're fairly isolationist. They don't want to have what has been long-term kind of U.S. policy. They want to avoid foreign entanglements. And that's a term that goes all the way back to President Washington and President Jefferson in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So this is a long-term U.S. foreign policy. Don't sign treaties, especially with European countries, because these Europeans are basically nuts. They keep going to war against each other. And in the 1700s, they fought dozens of wars against each other. So Washington and Jefferson and Adams, they hated the idea of getting involved with Europe and having treaty alliances, because if you sign a treaty with France or with Britain, they'll fight each other, and that will basically suck the U.S. into a European war that the U.S. has like no real interest in fighting. So this no foreign entanglements idea goes way, way back and was really normal U.S. foreign policy stance for the whole history of the country, which is kind of hard for us to understand today, because in our lifetimes, really since the early 1940s, the United States signs treaties all over the world. So the United States is deeply involved in all these controversies all over the globe, and is responsible for defending other countries against attack, even on other parts, the other side of the world. So today, an attack against a city in South Korea immediately brings the United States into what could be a very large conflict. But that's kind of the world that we know today, which would have been completely the opposite of what Americans thought in the 1920s and 1930s. So the United States is what we call isolationist. It wants to just kind of keep to itself in military alliances up until really World War II. So the Harding administration is invested in that idea and wants to kind of protect that idea of this avoiding foreign problems, really. They just want kind of open access for everybody everywhere, which would really benefit the U.S. economy and U.S. businesses, because U.S. economy is now the largest, most powerful in the world. So this is like saying the U.S. has kind of won the race of industrialization and wants to guarantee its future economic growth and enrichment by saying that everyone should have equal access everywhere, which would naturally benefit the most powerful companies and most powerful countries, which the United States really now is, at least economically, if not militarily. And the Harding administration looks to enforce this stuff. This isn't just like ideas they put out there and like statements to the world. They look to really force other countries to accept these ideas. And the biggest example of that enforcement is the Washington Naval Conference, which gets going in late 1921. I think it convenes in something like November 21. And remember, the Harding administration, Harding and Hughes and whatnot, they go into office in March of 1921. So barely, a half a year later, they call this International Military Conference, where the United States sets the agenda and writes up this document and tries to force other countries to sign it. And the document basically says that there will be limits on the size of how big other countries get to build their navies. And the naval limits of kind of ship construction, battleship construction, warship construction, is set up like this. Britain already has the biggest navy in the world. And they've had the biggest navy in the world for, well over 100 years, going way far back into at least the late 1600s. It's well known around the world. Britain does that because they're an island. So their military defense policy is to have a bunch of warships so they can never be invaded. And it's worked very well. They have not been successfully invaded for 1,000 years. So the United States says, okay, Britain is allowed to have the biggest navy in the world. But the United States, in this treaty, says that the U.S. government will be allowed to build up to that extent. So that Britain and the United States, under the terms of this treaty, are allowed to have the biggest navies in the world. They have 100% capacity of what is allowed under this contract, this international agreement, this treaty. And Japan, since it's an island, or a system of islands, it will be allowed to have a large navy to defend itself. So Japan will be allowed to build 60% as many warships as the United States and Britain are allowed to build in this treaty. And France and Italy are allowed to build 35% of the kind of total that Britain and the US are allowed to have. And since Germany had agreed to have a very tiny navy in the Versailles Treaty, Germany has like virtually zero navy allowed. The Soviet Union, well, they don't really sign on to this thing, but they're kind of kept out of it. But you can see just by which countries are allowed to have the big percentages, just by looking at this slide, you can tell that they're allowing their wartime allies to build up their military power for self-defense. There's not much on Austria or Hungary or any of the countries that kind of emerge out of the eviscerated Ottoman Empire, or Germany. So this is focused on keeping their friends powerful. Does that make sense? And another one written into this treaty is to guarantee open door access as the cornerstone of the kind of reliable center of international law. That everyone gets to, all companies get to move their boats around everywhere. And another big piece of it, I mean, obviously this is a military treaty because they're setting the terms of military limitations in the navies. The United States makes a very forceful argument that you can build up your navy according to these percentages, but you're not going to be allowed to build up your militaries in really any other way. And the Secretary of State, Hughes, gives the kind of opening speech of this conference. And he has a statement in his speech where he says, "All preparation for offensive war will stop now." That's a direct quote. And it's not a passive thing. He gets up there and he slams his fist on the podium and he says, "All preparation for offensive war stops now. You will not be allowed to do it. We will stop you. We will destroy you if you try." So this is not a passive thing that they throw out there. This is a threat from the U.S. government to all these other governments participating, saying you will not do this, we will not tolerate it. And of course, whenever you make a threat, you have to back it up. You can't just kind of tell someone not to do something and give them limitations. You have to back it up with a real kind of militant demand and a promise to do harm to anyone who gets out of line. And the U.S. announces at this conference that its policy will be to absolutely destroy any country that refuses to abide by these limitations and these demands. So any country that starts rebuilding its army in a big way, the United States government at this point says, we will destroy your economy. Because guess what? From the war, you've borrowed a lot of money from the United States and U.S. companies. And U.S. companies have invested to rebuild factories in your country. And if you start rebuilding your militaries, we'll call in those loans. We're not going to wait for monthly payments anymore. We're going to demand you pay everything up front right now. Or we might just tell our companies to pull their investments out of your country and watch your economy collapse. So this is real economic hardball. If you get out of line, we will destroy your national economy, which will basically destroy your country. And whenever you have an economic collapse, there's a real threat of revolutions or civil war, or all kinds of political problems within countries. So this is a real threat that's bordering on violent. And U.S. leaders also say, well, if that doesn't scare you enough and you want to rebuild your army, you can try it, but guess what? The United States has a bigger economy, is more prosperous. We have more tax revenue. So even if you want to rebuild your army, we'll just build our army, and since we have more money, we'll build a bigger army than you do. And we'll threaten you, maybe at that point, just with military invasion. So they're using the U.S. is using its economic power at this point as a real deep threat to the survival of foreign governments. And it's not a passive thing. So a lot of textbooks talk about how the United States withdrew from Europe in the 1920s or something like that. They didn't really do that. The United States withdrew its armies, but that economic threat of destruction is always there, and it's officially announced at this Washington Naval Conference, and that's why I like to talk about it so much, because a lot of textbooks just don't, which I think is personally just very weird. So the United States will continue using those kind of economic threats through the 1920s to try to force European countries to kind of abide by this, what Wilson called the New World Order. And that economic threat really starts to go away by 1929, or in 1929, when you get the stock market crash and the Great Depression starts to grow. The U.S. doesn't have an economic power anymore to threaten other countries. And that's where other countries really stop following U.S. demands. And in the 1930s, the U.S. largely stops making demands. The United States will want to deal with its own problem, its own depression first. And 1930s, the American perspective is usually, screw the rest of the world. We got to figure out how to solve our own crisis. And the 1920s, Europe is a very fragile place. It has all these new democracies. Before the war, before the Great War that started in 1914, there were only like 3 democracies, 3 what we call republics in Europe. In 1919, 1920, the year after all these treaties are signed, and these European countries and governments are rebuilt, suddenly there's 18 democracies. So the Versailles Treaty and other treaties that were signed to end the war and start up new governments spread democracy pretty far and wide throughout Europe. And it was a very kind of optimistic time for a lot of Europeans that want these citizenship rights and these voting rights. They want to elect their leaders instead of just living under a king who serves for life. So we'll talk about kind of several attempts through the 1920s to stabilize all these new democracies and an international cooperation system, since the U.S. doesn't really want to get involved outside of economic threats. So the Europeans will try to kind of come up with international agreements to stabilize their own governments. Really the biggest one, the obvious one, is called the League of Nations, which is part of the Versailles Treaty system that ends the war, ends World War I in 1919. The League of Nations, like we talked about before, set up like this international courtroom system where each country basically gets a vote, and instead of going to war, countries would basically sue each other in court. They'd file lawsuits at the League of Nations, and they'd go and make their arguments. And the members of the League, the countries of the world, would decide which side should be supported and what the settlement should be. The problem with the League of Nations system is that this courtroom system requires a unanimous decision, which, when you have 30 different countries involved, you almost never can get a unanimous decision in the leaderships of 30 countries to do really much of anything. So requiring a unanimous approval for any courtroom setting is really difficult, and that's why you see so many hung juries on controversial gray area kinds of prosecutions. Another problem with the League is that the League did not have an army to actually enforce its decisions. So this would be like, you have an international courtroom system, but no international police force and no international jail. So what happens when the court renders this decision? Even if you get a unanimous decision of something or other, there's no real ways of enforcing it, of forcing countries to hand over money in a settlement or hand over land or withdraw their troops or whatever's going on. The League of Nations tried to pass another law in 1924 called the Geneva Act or the Geneva Protocol, which tried to solve this lack of unanimous decision-making ability. But the United States stayed out of it, which kind of scuttled the whole thing, which destroyed the ability to ratify the whole thing. So that became a problem also. The next attempt are called the Locarno Agreements, which are basically pushed by the French government, the leaders in France, to establish an international treaty, especially of Eastern European countries, where France and Britain gets involved in this also. They sign an agreement with Poland and Czechoslovakia and a couple other Eastern European countries that if those Eastern European countries ever get attacked, if anyone ever invades Czechoslovakia or Poland, that the other members, like Britain and France, will come to their defense and defend their territory. So if Germany or any other country invades Poland, then Britain and France, by this treaty, are responsible for attacking Germany or whoever that original attacking country is, to help defend Poland and Czech's liberty, basically. This is often interpreted as an anti-German agreement because there's a lot of fear that Germany might try to reestablish dominance in Europe by attacking eastward and gobbling up territory and increasing the size of their country, which they were very successful at doing in World War I. There's also, some historians argue that especially when Germany gets involved, Germany signs on to the Locarno Agreements. There's an argument that historians make that Locarno Treaty was designed to inspire Germany to get closer involved with Britain and France for stability. So this brings Germany kind of fully back into international diplomacy on an equal level. Even more historians argue, a third kind of level argument that some historians go for, is that Britain and France sign defensive agreements with places like Poland and Czechoslovakia, specifically because they want to stop the Soviet Union from thinking about attacking westward and spreading communism by invasion. But in general, the Locarno Agreements are closely led by the leaders, by Britain, France, and Germany. A close cooperation between those three countries becomes known as the spirit of Locarno. And the problem with that, is we now know, is that international peace is mostly kept in Europe by this agreement, this cooperation between those three countries, those three dominant powers of Europe, Britain, France, and Germany. And we now know once that cooperation breaks down in the 1930s, then peace really goes out the window and you get a real threat of a renewed war. There's another one called the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, and this is largely an agreement signed between let's see, it's I think it's Germany and France. Kellogg being the kind of foreign minister, foreign policy leader of Germany, and Briand being the foreign policy leader of France. Their agreement to sign this treaty that officially says that war is illegal. Attacking another country is officially illegal, and other countries join on to this this treaty through the years. And it literally makes offensive war, one country attacking another, basically a war crime. So that's a legal attempt to stop spread of future wars. And in the kind of final level of this slide, the United States always stays out of these treaties, does not want to be involved in these what they call entangling alliances, especially these military alliances like Locarno. But the United States is always kind of, at least in the background, with that big economic threat, and handing out money to its friends and threatening to pull money out when its allies kind of get out of line. So the United States economic threat, a lot of historians argue, is what really keeps the peace in the 1920s. And again, once the U.S. financial collapse happens in 1929 and the Great Depression gets going, the U.S. economic threat just disappears suddenly. It dissipates. It just kind of evaporates. That's when certain countries like Germany in the 1930s will start taking a stance, a much more aggressive stance in Europe. So the next section is really the collapse of U.S. economic power. And to understand the collapse of it, you have to understand the system of money that's moving around that the U.S. relies on and helped design in a lot of ways. And to understand that, we have to go back to the treaty that ended the war in the first place, the 1919 Versailles Treaty. Part of that treaty officially declared Germany guilty of having started the war. So they're the ones that started the whole conflict, and therefore they're responsible for all the devastation, especially in like Belgium and northeastern France, and even to Britain, even though Britain was never invaded. Or parts of it were never conquered, and parts of Britain were attacked. And its ships out in the oceans were attacked, so it suffered some damages. But since Germany is officially admits to its guilt by signing the Versailles Treaty, Germany has to accept what are called reparations payments, basically monthly payments to especially Britain, France, and Belgium, the winners of the war, paying them back for all the damage that Germany inflicted on them by starting the war in the first place. And these payments are massive. The payments are so large that Germany, this new German democracy, has to increase taxes on its own people just to get the money together every month to pay cash payments to Britain and France on a monthly basis. And the next level is that Britain and France really rely on that incoming German money every single month to finance their own rebuilding after the war. And also, remember, Britain and France borrowed money from the United States and U.S. companies to continue fighting the war. So Britain and France, as governments, are in debt to American entities, government and private companies. So the British and French governments rely on that German money coming into their accounts, say on the very first day of the month. Just like you get a paycheck, you rely on that money coming in, and it has to be stable so you can pay your bills. And Britain and France, they basically bring the money, they get the money into their accounts on the first of the month, just like you get a paycheck, and on the second day of the month, they pay a bunch of money out to American entities, the American government or American banks or other American companies. Just like your paycheck comes into your account one day, and the next couple of days you start paying your bills and it goes out to other people. So it doesn't really stay your money for very long because you've taken on, car payments or mortgages or credit cards or whatever debts that you have signed on for, which is a good reason to avoid debt as much as you possibly can. So buying new cars, if you need a car, maybe try to buy a used car that's reliable or something like that. I personally bought my car on Craigslist for $400 and it runs really well. So you don't have to go out and buy a new car for $25,000. And if you don't want to make that monthly payment, there's other options out there for you. Just a suggestion. Because in the third level of this slide, because a lot of this German money goes to Britain and France, and then quickly in the next couple of days goes to American entities like U.S. businesses. U.S. businesses want that money. I mean, that's why people go into business. That's why they form corporations. They're profit-driven. They want that money. And so U.S. businesses put pressure on the U.S. government to put pressure on the British and French governments and the German government to actually keep this money flowing. And remember, I mean, just like the kind of campaign finance system we have today, the U.S. democracy is really driven by money. Politicians win office by usually begging for money from rich people and rich companies. So there's a close connection between U.S. businesses and U.S. wealthy people and the politicians we have running the government. Because those politicians beg for campaign donations. And those businesses and those rich people, they don't just give money because they're friendly, because we like you and we think you're going to do beautiful things for the country or something like that. They often see it as an investment. If I'm really rich and I want to get someone elected, say president or senator or something like that, I'll give them money, but not just because I like them, it's because I want something from them. And if they win the election through my help by giving them money, maybe when they're in office, they'll do me a favor. So there's a close connections between U.S. businesses and what we call the elite, or in today's terms, the 1%, and our elected politicians. And those elected politicians respond very heavily toward the demands of the people who gave them money to run for office in the first place. So, like, today you basically have to have $1 billion to run for president and win, to have a decent chance of winning. And if you don't have $1 billion, you have to go beg for it. And even to get elected to Congress, just one of your local congressmen goes to Washington, D.C. and just becomes one of, 435 other congressmen from all over or congresspeople from all over the country, you have to have $1 million. And if you don't have $1 million, you have to beg for it and make promises. So that's obviously still ongoing today, and has giant ramifications for U.S. foreign policy today and back then, and tax policy and education policy and highways and everything you can think of what government does around here. So the U.S. businesses put a lot of pressure on the U.S. government to collect that money and to keep this cycle of money constantly going. And the problem, though, is that the new German democracy in the 1920s has consistent problems making those payments. And the German government starts doing all kinds of wacky things to raise the money on a monthly basis to make the payments so they don't fall behind. So their first attempt is really to raise taxes as much as they possibly can on German society to get the tax revenue on a monthly basis to make the payments, but even that's not enough. And they try all kinds of schemes, financial schemes, to make the payments, and they just can't figure anything out. And in their most desperate move, the German government, democratically elected government, decides that they're just going to print a bunch of paper money and hand it over to Britain and France and their other creditors. And when you do that on a very, very large scale, that does a lot of damage. So it sounds kind of funny, if I buy a new car, and I have a $20,000 debt, which ends up being $400, $500 a month or something like that, on a monthly payment for a car. Yeah, it'd be great if I could just one day print $20,000 and just hand it to someone and say, "Here's your money, leave me alone." But when governments do that, they can create a crisis. And this is what happens in Germany. The German government starts printing massive trillions of their dollars in just brand new currency. They print it, and it's official money because the government makes it. And they start handing it out to its people and say, "Ha ha ha, here's a whole bunch of cash. have fun with it. The problem, though, is that when you massively increase the amount of money in society, that means that every single piece of that money, every single, say, dollar, is much less valuable because it's not as rare as it used to be. And that destabilizes the currency. And when you do it on a huge scale, that's what you end up with, what economists call hyperinflation. And Germany does this in the 1920s. And other countries have done it before and since, even pretty recently. And it destroys their economy. Because, say, in Germany in the 1920s, if you're an average factory worker and you're making, I don't know, $300 a week working in that factory, and you go down to the local store or the local market or whatever and buy a loaf of bread for your family to eat that week, maybe on Monday that loaf of bread is $1. And you can afford that because you're making $300 a week, so that's not that bad. But once the government starts printing huge amounts of money and each dollar is less valuable, guess what? The market owner, the grocer, they want more dollars for that loaf of bread. And when you get into hyperinflation, like in 1926, or no, 1923, in January 1923, you can go down the market and you can buy a loaf of bread for $1 on, say, Monday. A week later in January, you go down the market and it's $5 for a loaf of bread. And a week after that, it's $100 for a loaf of bread. And a week after that, it's $500 for a loaf of bread. The prices are increasing that fast, that much, to the point that the average workers, I mean, you could go to your boss and ask for a raise, but no employer is going to give you that much of a raise that fast. And hyperinflation destroys the economy and destroys the workforce because they can't afford to feed their families. They can't afford to pay their rent or buy clothes. And anyone who has any money saved in a bank account, maybe today if you have like $200,000 saved in a bank account, you might be able to retire on that if you don't have any debts. But if hyperinflation hits and suddenly a loaf of bread is $2,000, that money ain't going to last you very long. So every kind of working type person who's really not extremely rich, it destroys their ability to survive. And it's their own elected government that did this. So this destroys their confidence in their own political leaders. And when the politicians can't figure a way to stop it, that destroys the German confidence in the whole political system. And a lot of German voters distrust their elected leaders so much. They basically say, the president of the country and all these people we've elected, they got us into this mess. They don't know how to get us out. So what you start seeing throughout the 1920s is new political parties starting to rise up and saying, basically, the people in office screwed up really bad, so much you can't even trust them anymore. So why not take a chance and vote for us, this new party, because we have an idea about how to solve this crisis. And there's many new political parties that rise up in Germany in the 1920s. The most famous that we know of today is the Nazi Party, which means National Socialist Party. And we'll talk about kind of their ideology in a little bit. But through the 1920s, the Nazi Party starts off very, very small, getting like 1 or 2% of the vote, but their vote totals in each election start to rise in the 20s, and especially in the early 30s when the Great Depression hits internationally. But really, Germany is going through a Great Depression in the 1920s already. And these different parties say, vote for us and we'll solve the mess, which is at least in my lifetime, a very consistent way to get elected in the United States since, say, the 1970s. If you start giving speeches saying the people running the country have screwed up badly and they don't know what they're doing. Put me in office and I'll go fix the mess. That's a winning slogan. That's a winning statement in U.S. politics for the past, 30, 40 years. So, there's that. All right, and, the U.S. leaders and U.S. economists understand that this problem is going on. They see the desperation of the German government. I mean, this is international news. No, it's not any secret at all. And U.S. leaders understand how much the U.S. economic health is really reliant on Germany being fairly stable and healthy and making its payments. Because those payments go to Britain and France, and then that money comes to the United States. So it's this merry-go-round of money. And the U.S. leaders and bankers, in cooperation with Britain and France largely, they start coming up with financial schemes to help the German government make their payments. So you get one plan called the Dawes Plan in 24, which basically gives loans from U.S. banks to the German government to help it make its monthly payments, its reparation payments to Britain and France. So that kind of keeps the German government kind of afloat for a little while. But early in 1929, the German government's at another crisis point. They still can't make the payments. So U.S. bankers come up with a new plan called the Young Plan in early 29, which finally sets a total German debt level at $26 trillion. And sets a payment schedule, monthly payment schedule, that will last almost 60 years. And to put this in context, today, the U.S. economy, every dollar exchanged, every dollar spent in the U.S. economy today is about $17 trillion. So the German debt level set almost 100 years ago is 26 trillion, a little bit more than every dollar exchanged in the United States today. And one thing you have to remember that the US dollar was worth a whole lot more back then than it is today. You could go into a restaurant and buy a hamburger for 25 cents. Whereas today, buy your hamburger meal, a decent hamburger, not the dollar menu at McDonald's where you get a hamburger that's like the size of your thumb, and it doesn't look very good. But you could go into a restaurant and buy a hamburger meal with French fries and whatnot for 25 cents. Whereas today, that's what, a good $7, $8 at a sit-down restaurant. Not fast food, because fast food didn't really exist back then in the way that we know it today. So $26 trillion is just an astronomical amount of money. It's like an unthinkable amount of money. That would probably be in the quadrillions of dollars today. And setting up a payment schedule over 60 years, this basically says that, okay, in 1929, if Germany pays up its monthly amounts, then the whole debt will be paid off in 1988, which is a ridiculous amount of time. That'd be like saying, today in, 2015, that the U.S. national debt is set on a payment schedule so that it'll be paid off in 2075. I mean, that's lifetimes. That's hard for us to even imagine what the world's going to look like then. I mean, we can't even really imagine what the world's going to look like in 2025, much less, 50 years after that. I mean, who even knows if people will even be around at that point? Personally, I'm not very confident, but that's just me. So what the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan basically is like these financial schemes to try to figure out how to keep the German government afloat. And in the end, it's really just loans to pay off loans. Just giving more money, signing people into larger debt in order to pay off the debt that they already have. Which is not a good system. It's not a good idea. If you have credit card loans or car loans or something like that, if you owe an amount of money that you can't really pay per month right now, you'll get banks and other institutions coming to you and saying, okay, we'll give you a new loan, over maybe a longer term. So instead of like this 5-year car payment, we'll give you a 10-year loan, which will lower your monthly payment from maybe $400 down to like $300, so maybe you can make your payment. But you're going to pay it off over a longer amount of money, so you'll end up owing even more money than you did before. Taking on new loans to pay off old loans is usually not a good idea. It tends to dig you in deeper for the longer term. But that's kind of where the U.S. government and international bankers arrived at by 1929. It's the only idea that they really have left. They've tried everything else. Germany's tried raising taxes, they tried printing money, and now they're just borrowing as much as they can. And a lot of this stuff is run by U.S. bankers. And dependent on the health of the U.S. economy, which goes into a tailspin, goes into a crash. In October 29, that started by the U.S. stock market crash. And this creates a financial panic in the United States, largely amongst giant corporations and investment banks and other banks and whatnot. And here's another picture. During the stock crash, when everyone's selling stock as much as they can, a lot of the stockbrokers can't even stand to look at the numbers anymore, so they leave the building, they go outside, because they're so depressed they just can't stand to watch it. And many of them kill themselves because they have their lifetime investments, all their retirement savings invested in the stock market, and they're losing everything. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is actually, it's not the whole stock market. The Dow Jones is an average stock value of what are usually the 30 most valuable companies on the stock exchange. So these are seen as like the most powerful and stable and prosperous U.S. companies, and their stock value drops 40%, almost half, in 1 month. And when companies start experiencing that, they start, in order to try to become profitable again, they start laying off their workers. So you start getting the rise of unemployment as factory workers and other corporate employees are laid off, as these companies desperately try to reduce payrolls in order to financially survive all this. But then, since a lot of workers are getting laid off, they stop going to restaurants, they stop going to movies, they stop buying new clothes and all this other kind of stuff. They get really, even if you keep your job, you tend to get really worried that you're going to get laid off, so you start saving money as much as you possibly can in order to continue paying your rent and buying food if you do get laid off, and hoping to survive it. So once the layoffs hit, that spreads so much fear throughout the whole economy. People stop spending, restaurants start going out of business, movie houses start shutting down, theaters start shutting down, and that just leads into even more unemployment, more workers lose their jobs, and U.S. trade, the U.S. economy drops 40% the next year in 1930. And that's what really starts the Great Depression as we know it today. And the Great Depression goes international. Spreads to Europe, spreads to Asia, spread just all over the planet. So the next section is really what happens in European politics and in American politics. A lot of these democracies in Europe and the United States are often what we call liberal parliaments or liberal democracies. Basically, they have constitutions, and constitutions, just like the U.S. Constitution, is kind of replicated all over the place, where the Constitution says that the people have these certain rights that the government is not allowed to attack. Like in the United States, you have the right to freedom of speech, you get to join whatever religion you want, you have the freedom to assemble in public and to demand change and to march up and down the street, demanding that the government, make some changes or something like that. There's freedom of the press, there's freedom of your being in your house. You're not allowed to, the government's not allowed to break into your house and search it without a warrant signed by a judge. If they arrest you, they have to file charges against you within 48 hours. And if you have charges filed against you, you have the right to a speedy trial. You have the right to not be tortured while you're under kind of government detention. So you have all these rights just in the U.S. Constitution. And that's stuff that liberals usually like a lot. They say that this equality, this is what creates equality and liberty. Everyone has these rights, and this is how you avoid dictatorships. The government's not allowed to attack you without, filing charges and accusing you of crime. And this is one of the kind of great accomplishments of liberalism from the 1800s. This idea that the rule of law, your equality under the Constitution as citizens, is more important than any political crisis. That if a political crisis breaks out, the government's not allowed to just go out and start arresting everybody and start torturing people. That politicians have to figure out some other way. And this is a very popular idea, especially in the United States and Canada and Europe, and it's very popular all over the world because individual people tend to like having these kinds of rights. But a new political movement starts developing in the United States and in Europe especially, called fascism. And fascism is basically authoritarianism. It's anti-democratic. Fascism basically says that we need to have a government where leaderships can make fast decisions to solve crises. And of course, this gets going in places like Italy and Germany in the 1920s, where they're already having these economic catastrophes that we already talked about. And one of the big fascist criticisms of liberalism is that Europe is a liberal democracy, a bunch of liberal democracies in the 1920s, and it's a failure. They hadn't got them anywhere. So the fascist idea, fascism as a political movement, says that solving the crisis is more important than people's individual rights. That, yeah, individual rights and liberties are great, but when a crisis hits, when the economy is collapsing in free fall, the government needs to make decisions. And they need to make fast decisions, and they need to be able to have the power to implement those decisions in order to, if it's a crisis or like a revolution of a certain group trying to overthrow the government needs to have the power to arrest those people and stop the crisis. And even if the government has to kind of victimize some people, the fascists argue it's good for the whole nation, all of the people, because it'll solve the crisis as fast as possible. And usually in the 1920s, at least, in the early 30s, the fascists are talking about mostly economic crises. So that's one fascist kind of critique of liberalism and democracy. Another one is also a kind of economic critique, because liberalism creates congresses and parliaments and voting rights where you elect your leaders. And democracy is often slow and sloppy in responding to a crisis. So just like we've seen, say, even in the 1920s and 30s, when an economic catastrophe hits, what does Congress do in the United States? Do they quickly start passing laws and dealing with the crisis and creating solutions? Usually not. The U.S. Congress is much more normally very slow to deal with that kind of stuff. So what does a Congress do? Usually Congress, when a crisis hits, Congress will debate for maybe a few weeks about whether a crisis even exists or not. Certain politicians are often so corrupt, even when the Depression hits, or what we today call recessions, some politicians will just deny that that's even going on. So there's a big debate often in Congress about whether a crisis is even happening, much less what to do about it. So they may take a vote in Congress, yes, we have a crisis, what are we going to do about it? Usually Congress, once they decide there's a crisis, they vote to form a subcommittee of Congress to investigate the crisis and propose solutions. So they form a group of a few congressmen who go out and they kind of take testimony from experts and whatever field the crisis is happening in. So if it's an economic crisis, they'll interview all these different kinds of economists and kind of draw up a list of possible solutions, and that could take months and months and months. And even if the committee, creates its own list of solutions, the committee usually doesn't have the power to actually implement those solutions. So those proposals go back to the whole Congress, and then the Congress will debate about what solutions to implement. And again, there's political corruption, and different parties have different perspectives on what should be done. So sometimes that debate could go on for weeks and weeks, if not months. So eventually, maybe months or maybe even years later, after the crisis has started, Congress might finally pass a law to deal with the crisis. And that's, as they say, democracy is sloppy, because democracy empowers a lot of different voices and proposals, and democracies tend to want to listen to all possibilities and then try to pick the best one, or the one that you can at least get a majority vote in favor of. So a parliament is basically like Congress, and it's a representative group of lawmakers elected by the people. Parliament is usually the kind of European, well, most of the rest of the world calls them parliaments. The United States calls them Congress. And parliaments and Congresses, they often spend so much time debating this stuff that the people can't buy bread. The people are starving. And the fascism says the people don't have time for all these corrupt politicians to finally make a decision. The people don't have weeks when they're starving and unemployed and homeless. The people need a solution. So the fascist idea is, forget all these Congresses and parliaments. We need a government in place that has the authority to make fast decisions to help the people now. If a crisis hits on Monday, fascists say we need an authority in place in the government somehow, a constitutional kind of authority, to make a decision on Tuesday and actually implement the thing to help the people. And the fascists often admit that if you're going to make a decision that quick, that fast, within hours of a crisis breaking out, sometimes it might always be the best decision or the best solution, but they say it's better than waiting weeks and weeks and weeks, maybe months or years, for a democracy and a parliament or a Congress will take all that time to decide what the best decision is. The fascists say we need a decision. We need a solution. And even if it's not the best one, something's better than nothing. And another level of kind of a problem with democracy is that democracy is built on the vote of the average people. So when candidates run for office in a democracy, they win by getting the most votes. And the best way to get the most votes is to go to the average people, the average workers, what we today call the working class or the middle class, and make promises to them. Vote for me, and if I go into office, I'll advocate this for you. I'll lower your taxes, I'll build better schools or highways. In the early 1900s, it's usually some kind of labor reform, like a minimum wage or some kind of pension or factory safety or something like that, or land reform to get the farmers' votes. And that's a very frequent promise that politicians and democracies make in the early 1900s, labor reforms or land reforms. But much like you see in the United States today, you can have candidates that give speeches to large groups of average people. Or they make commercials, TV commercials, where they say, put me in office and I'll do this great thing for the average people. I'll lower your taxes or build better schools or whatever. The problem, though, is that they're still begging for money from rich people. So even candidates that make all these promises during the campaign, even if they win election, they go into office, they're often so corrupted by begging for money from the rich that they can't actually fulfill those promises. Because if they actually support laws to fulfill those promises, when they go for re-election, the rich won't give them money anymore. Because the interest of the average people and the interest of the rich are opposed to each other. And you got to take sides usually. And politicians know that. So the great trick in democracies is often to make promises to the people during campaigns while also taking money from the rich during the campaign. And if you win the election, go into office, you have to find a way of still making those promises, or at least symbolically acting like you're doing stuff for the people, but behind the scenes, in reality, you're still serving the rich that funded your campaign. And the fascists say that openly. So oftentimes, back then and today, usually politicians running for office, they'll make pretty liberal, popular promises. We'll build better schools or highways or lower taxes on the average people. Those are usually pretty kind of liberal demands, because the people want more rights for them and more kind of opportunities for themselves, and that's usually liberalism. It's the conservatives who don't want that stuff, because conservatives are usually very wealthy people, and the rich don't want usually to spend more money on education that will benefit someone else. The rich want stuff for themselves. And especially in the early 1900s, the rich are almost always conservative. They don't want labor reforms and minimum wages and stuff like that. That's against their interests, because they're the business owners. They're the factory owners. And it's the fascists, especially in Germany, that figure out how to mobilize the masses. The fascists in Germany realize that they're living in a democracy. The Nazi Party tried to overthrow the German democracy in the 1920s, and that didn't work. And Hitler himself served jail time for that coup attempt. And afterward, he got out and led especially the Nazi Party in mass political mobilization. Stopped trying to make deals with the elites, and instead went to the people and held mass rallies to mobilize as many voters as he possibly can. And they did that by making promises to the German people. We're going to do great things for you, the people. Because the Nazi is short for National Socialists. And they propose all kinds of things that we today call the welfare state. They promise highways. They promise jobs for unemployed workers. They promise better hospital systems. So that the German government's going to get even more involved in the healthcare system than it was before. The Germans had a universal healthcare system going back to the 1800s called the Bismarckian healthcare system, built by the guy who kind of founded the modern German Empire. And you can see it in pictures in the late 20s. Hitler riding around in a limo, going to the people, driving slowly through the streets and trying to mobilize the masses of German voters. And once Hitler gets into office in the 1930s, will run even much, much larger mass public rallies in sports stadiums, in amphitheaters, and all kinds of things, where he'll give speeches. So this is the gigantic, scaled-up mass rallies to convince the people that, and they put this on radio and newspaper articles and whatnot, to convince the mass of the German population that the people are behind this movement. And even in their campaign posters from the 1920s, Nazi Party promises things to the average German family, the average German voter. So on the left you see kind of the average family that the German government will help if the Nazi Party wins the election. So this is a National Socialist, and that's what the NSDAP is. It's basically the Nazi Party of the German workers, basically, the German people. And you can already see that there's, and even in this poster on the right, which is kind of the Nazi Party symbolized by this real big, tall, strong guy, listening to the demands of the people. And back then, today we know what the Nazi Party eventually does with all the repression and whatnot. So this looks like a scary poster. It looks like, the big strong government's going to push the people around. But no, in the 1920s, this is a promise that, yes, the party's going to be big and strong, and it's going to centralize authority for the government, but it's also going to listen to the people's demands. It's going to be a nice government that will have the people's needs kind of foremost in its mind. And you can also see with these posters that it's becoming a very kind of racist interpretation. The Nazi Party under Hitler's leadership is already thinking about the purebred German, perfect, 7-foot-tall, white, blonde-haired guy as like the epitome of what Hitler's vision of what Germany should be. So it gets kind of imbued with a lot of racism. And if you look at kind of the poster on the right, you see a lot of kind of smaller, darker people that wear glasses so their eyesight isn't as good, and they're kind of dirtier, right? They're not as great as the kind of big blonde guy. And that's one thing to notice, that the Nazi Party is promising this kind of scaled up welfare state, and when they gain power in the early 1930s, they will build it up. They'll build up their highway system. The modern freeway system that we know today really starts in Germany in the 1930s. The Autobahn. And that's just one thing that Hitler and the Nazi Party fulfill some of their promises to the German people, the German voters who put them in office. But another major problem is that they also take over the national healthcare system, and they start to redefine it and give advice for depending on who you are in Germany, what community you are, or if you have blonde hair, like who you should marry and how you should raise your kids and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of connected with healthcare, but it's also becoming overtly racist over time. And the Nazis tend to define the German nation, the German people, as a race community whose survival in this international competition, this survival of the fittest nation, the Nazi idea is basically that the German people only survive if they purify themselves and get their best and their strongest and their most kind of purebred, blondest and bluest eyed type people to marry each other and have as many babies as possible to kind of build up the power of their race. And this is all tied in with their racial welfare state ideas. So Nazi policy is basically, in the 1930s, this racial self-preservation, which is linked into their healthcare system, and who should be allowed to marry each other, and which groups are going to be kind of isolated and kept out of power, and eventually kept out of the economy, as we now know. This directly feeds into Nazi foreign policy in the 30s. Because if the German self-preservation is based on unifying all Germans and picking out who the best Germans are, that means you have to bring all Germans back together into one unified Germany. And remember, after the end of World War I, Germany was split up, and parts of old German lands under the old German Empire was given off to Czechoslovakia and Poland and all these different areas. So German-speaking peoples are not living in Germany anymore. And Nazi foreign policy is to say, we need to get all those Germans back together in one Germany, and that implies they have to go out and take that land back. And that leads into the idea that they have to overthrow the Versailles Treaty system. And one of the great tragedies is that the leaders of Britain and France and the United States, they didn't understand those connections. And in the 1920s, you can even see this in New York Times articles from printed in the United States. They just didn't take Hitler very seriously. They thought he was a clown. They thought he was some crazy guy running for office, that he'll never get elected. He'll never get into power. So you don't really have to analyze his ideas too much, because he's never going to be important enough to matter. And he gets into power in the 30s and starts implementing all this stuff in Germany. And this directly leads into World War II. And you can see that the Nazi Party vote is, it's kind of significant. It's 2 or 3% in Germany in the 1920s, as the German economy kind of goes up and down chaotically. And then once the big problems hit, once German unemployment starts to go up around 1929, once the financial crash in the United States hits, and then spreads to German banks in 1930, you get a wave of German bank failures, and unemployment starts to skyrocket in Germany. So many workers are getting unemployed that they start feeling that maybe we'll take a risk with this Nazi party, because politicians we've been voting for throughout the 20s, they're not solving this problem. And in the 1932 German parliamentary Congress elections, basically, the Nazi Party's vote share skyrockets. The Nazi Party gets 40% of the vote in their congressional elections in 32. Hitler runs for president, and he's defeated. So Hitler's the leader of his party, of the Nazi Party, by 32. That much is extremely obvious. He runs for president, he's defeated, but his party is the big vote getter for Congress. And so the German president, who's re-elected, decides to give Hitler an office in the German administration, in the executive branch. And that position is called the Chancellor. The Chancellor at that time is basically like kind of like the Speaker of the House in the United States. It's like the secretary or the leader of the biggest party in Congress. So it's like a bureaucratic position. And that position is supposed to communicate with the president. So it's like a cabinet position within the administration, the executive branch. And Hitler accepts the position. It's largely a ceremonial position. It's not very powerful when Hitler accepts it. It's been around for years and years and was never really that powerful. The re-elected president, who's from a different political party, and his advisors say, okay, Hitler's group, they won the congressional elections, so let's bring them in. Let's bring Hitler into the cabinet in order to shut him up. Because if he's now a member of helping run the government, he can't be very critical anymore. He can't go into the government and continue saying that this government sucks, because he's a part of it now. So they think they can control him and kind of shut him up in his most heavy criticisms, and by giving him this office that really isn't all that important. The problem, though, is that Hitler is Hitler, and so once he gets the office, he quickly kind of conspires to build up the power of that office to the point where he'll eventually kind of take over the German government. This would be like in 1932-33. This would be like, say, Obama, the Democrat, runs for re-election in 2012, and there's a Republican who runs against him and gets a large amount of the vote. But the Republican presidential candidate loses. Obama wins his re-election. But the Republican Party wins in Congress in those same elections, in that same year. So as a consolation, in order to build a kind of national unity, Obama offers a Republican candidate who lost the election a position in Obama's cabinet. And maybe like a secondary position, like Secretary of Commerce or something like that. Not a really powerful one. As a kind of offer of compromise to build a unity government. But Hitler being Hitler, he's not interested in compromise. He's interested in building up his party and eventually taking over the government. And he's successful in doing that over the next couple years, as we'll talk about later as we get into World War II.